The COVID response operated within a long-accumulated architecture of legal immunities, privileges, and accountability shields that have been systematically expanded through decades of legislation, judicial precedents, and emergency power doctrines. These protections enabled officials, agencies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, media entities, technology platforms, hospitals, and educational institutions to implement mask mandates, vaccine policies, lockdowns, and related measures with minimal risk of civil or criminal repercussions. The framework included the PrEP Act's sweeping liability shields for covered countermeasures, emergency use authorizations, public health emergency declarations, sovereign and qualified immunity doctrines, and state-level emergency powers. This layered structure effectively granted broad operational immunity while preserving only narrow, high-bar exceptions such as willful misconduct, which proved extraordinarily difficult to establish. This accumulative legal architecture did not arise spontaneously. It built upon prior emergency responses and public health legislation, including the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986 signed by President Reagan, which removed most vaccine manufacturers from traditional tort liability and substituted a no-fault compensation program. Subsequent expansions through the PrEP Act, 2005, and repeated invocations during declared emergencies created a robust shield specifically tailored for mass countermeasure deployment. Judicial precedents granting deference to executive and public health authorities during crises further insulated decision-makers. The result was a pre-existing environment in which actors could anticipate operating with practical and legal immunity when implementing large-scale policies, even when those policies produced foreseeable constitutional violations, deaths, injuries, and harm to minors. The strategic expansion of these immunities and the corresponding obsolescence of accountability mechanisms strongly indicates long-term planning and premeditated design. Laws, rules, precedents, and institutional arrangements were positioned over decades to create precisely the conditions under which unprecedented abuses could occur with minimal fear of consequences. This pre-planning of the legal infrastructure itself constitutes an additional layer of conspiracy and malum in se criminality. By embedding broad immunity shields into the system, participants could knowingly advance policies constituting COVID treason, unconstitutional power centralization, COVID murder, foreseeable deaths through coercive mandates and protocols, and COVID child abuse, medical and psychological interventions on minors, while operating under the assurance that traditional avenues of accountability had been systematically neutralized or rendered ineffective. The coordination between pharmaceutical companies, government agencies, global health organizations, financial networks, and media tech entities further benefited from interlocking immunities that covered distribution, promotion, censorship, and enforcement activities. Compounding effects on imprescriptible offenses and the premeditation of impunity. The prepositioning of immunity frameworks directly compounds the imprescriptible nature of the COVID crimes. When actors plan and implement policies while knowing they enjoy layered protections from liability and prosecution, the offenses move beyond mere negligence or recklessness into the realm of deliberate, calculated radical evil. The knowledge that PrEP Act shields, emergency powers, qualified immunity, and no-fault compensation programs would largely insulate them from consequences demonstrates conscious design rather than good faith error. This premeditated exploitation of the legal architecture elevates the malice element across all designations. COVID treason becomes a calculated assault on constitutional order with built-in impunity. COVID murder incorporates the foreseeable lethal outcomes of policies enacted under guaranteed protections. And COVID child abuse reflects the intentional deployment of harmful interventions on minors within a system engineered to prevent redress. The accumulation of these immunities over decades, from Reagan-era vaccine legislation through post-9/11 and pandemic preparedness acts, reveals a deliberate trajectory toward creating an environment permissive of massive societal experimentation with reduced accountability. Participants in the COVID response operated with the full awareness that this framework would shield them, as evidenced by the rapid invocation of PrEP Act declarations, emergency powers expansions, and coordinated use of censorship mechanisms that further insulated the operation. This strategic inflation of immunities forms an integral part of the pre-planning conspiracy, transforming what might otherwise be viewed as isolated policy failures into a coordinated criminal enterprise executed with foreknowledge of impunity. The absence of meaningful accountability mechanisms, narrow willful misconduct exceptions, underfunded compensation programs with low success rates, prosecutorial discretion, and judicial deference, completed the architecture of immunity. This system effectively functioned as a license for the commission of COVID crimes on a societal scale. The pre-planning of both the operational response and the legal shields that would protect it demonstrates the depth of the malum in se offenses. The COVID crimes therefore encompass not only the direct harms of mandates and policies, but also the premeditated creation and exploitation of a legal environment designed to enable and conceal those harms. Strategic implications for perpetual accountability. The engineered immunity framework reinforces the necessity of treating the COVID crimes as imprescriptible under the event-specific jurisprudential model. Because the offenses were planned and executed with the explicit knowledge that traditional accountability had been neutralized, they fall even more squarely within the categories of treason, murder, and child abuse that carry no statute of limitations. The public record of legislative enactments, emergency declarations, PrEP Act invocations, and institutional coordination provide self-evident evidence of both the crimes and the premeditated shielding that accompanied them. This layer of analysis strengthens the centrality of COVID crimes within the broader interconnected criminal sequence. The same networks that benefited from accumulated immunities during the COVID response continue to operate across other events. Removing COVID criminals through imprescriptible proceedings disrupts the entire architecture of protected power. The pre-planned immunity system, far from serving legitimate public health needs, operated as an enabler of radical evil that must itself be confronted through perpetual accountability measures. The accumulative legal framework of immunities thus stands as both evidence and instrument of the COVID crimes. It demonstrates that the response was not merely reactive but strategically insulated from the outset. This realization demands that the full weight of imprescriptible justice be applied to dismantle the system that enabled such widespread, protected criminality. The public record reveals both the offenses and the deliberate architecture that protected their commission, leaving no refuge in claims of good faith or unforeseen consequences. Perpetual accountability remains the only response commensurate with the scale and premeditation of the harms inflicted. Conclusion. The accumulative legal framework of immunities and accountability shields formed a deliberate architecture that enabled the COVID response to proceed with minimal risk of civil or criminal consequences. Through the PrEP Act, emergency powers declarations, sovereign and qualified immunity, the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, and supporting judicial precedents, officials, pharmaceutical companies, institutions, and administrators operated under broad protections specifically suited for large-scale countermeasure deployment. These layered safeguards effectively neutralized traditional avenues of redress while preserving only narrow, high-bar exceptions that proved largely inaccessible. This prepositioned immunity structure reveals a strategic element of long-term planning. The systematic expansion of liability protections and emergency authorities over decades created an environment expressly permissive of the unprecedented scale of policy implementation witnessed during the COVID response. Participants could advance measures constituting COVID treason, COVID murder, and COVID child abuse with foreknowledge that the legal system had been engineered to shield them from meaningful accountability. The premeditated inflation of immunities transforms policy decisions from potential negligence into calculated malum in, say, offenses executed with built-in impunity. Ultimately, the engineered absence of accountability forms an integral layer of the COVID crimes themselves. It demonstrates conscious design rather than mere opportunism, reinforcing the imprescriptible character of the offenses within the event-specific jurisprudential framework. The public record of legislative enactments, emergency declarations, and institutional coordination provides self-evident evidence of both the harms inflicted and the protective architecture that enabled them. This comprehensive system of immunity demands perpetual accountability to restore the moral and constitutional order that the COVID response systematically undermined. The framework of COVID treason, COVID murder, and COVID child abuse, unshielded by temporal limitations, stands as the necessary legal response to crimes planned and protected in advance.